Tolkien's Tengwar, Chapter 1, The History of the Tengwar. My Govannen, and welcome to part 1 of what is planned to become a deep dive into Tolkien's Tengwar letters that you probably know at least from the famous inscription on Sauron's One Ring. But even if you don't quite know yet what I'm talking about, since you have clicked on this video, you are most likely very well aware that J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the best-selling books The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, was a philologist first and foremost, creating 2 major languages and the outlines to many minor ones. Now, constructed languages, or conlangs, weren't a new thing, of course, but what was and still is special about Tolkien's approach was that these languages don't exist in a vacuum, but in an intricate, interwoven scenario of a fictitious historical evolution of a primitive Elvish language and its various later branches, complete with etymological intricacies, semantic changes, and of course phonological developments, about which the philology professor of course knew a thing or two. In such a faux historical setting, of course, there needs to be a means of notation. Otherwise, how would knowledge of these things have come down to us if not through writing? And of course, Tolkien came up with a large variety of those. So in this video series, I would like to take a closer look at the writing systems that the professor created. First and foremost, the Tengwar of Feanor in all its varieties. So let us begin by having a look into both the external and the internal histories. The external chronology. Nobody could be blamed for thinking that Tolkien began developing writing systems to go along with his invented languages, so that in the internal chronology there was a means for Elvish scholars to write and systematically analyze their own languages. But the fact of the matter is that in all likelihood the first writing system that Tolkien created was entirely disconnected from his languages and the myths in which they existed. In early 1919, Tolkien came up with a script to write English phonetically, and he used it to write in his diary at first. Already working on the first versions of his myths at the time, however, it's no surprise that he also began writing fragments of his prose and verse in his new script, and I can only assume that this was how he quickly decided to incorporate that system into his world, by connecting it with his languages. First and foremost, he still continued to write English in it, but he soon began developing a system by which the phonology of the earliest iteration of Quenya could be adequately represented. For the most part, these letters were called Rúmilian, as in the letters attributed to an elf named Rúmil. And for the next 6 years at least, Tolkien kept revisiting and changing minor and major aspects about them. Visually, Tolkien might have been inspired by Brahmic scripts such as Devanagari, many assume, often being arranged on one side of a writing line with diacritics being placed on the other side. Mostly Tolkien went for a vertical arrangement, with diacritics mostly on the left, but sometimes the whole arrangement was rotated 90 degrees, with the diacritics now being on top. For this kind of arrangement he quickly came up with different names like Gondolik or Gnomish, linking it with those elves who would later become the Noldor and their language. And eventually he would even state that the letters were originally written from right to left, and that only in books and cursive form it was usually written from top to bottom. This growing tendency towards a horizontal arrangement eventually resulted in the Gnomish usage being distinct from the original one, and that the orientation of the letters in regular vertical writing is maintained, but they are still written horizontally with the diacritics above. It appears to have been at this point, around 1922, that Tolkien had the idea to give the gnomes a writing system of their own, resulting in the first documents in a new script that is usually referred to as the Valmaric script. Between 1922 and 1925, both Rúmilian and Valmaric coexisted, and it has to be assumed that they had some relationship in the internal chronology as well, but Tolkien is never quite explicit about this. After 1925, however, Tolkien doesn't appear to have given much attention to Rúmilian anymore. They would always remain a part of the internal history, but he shifted his main focus to the Valmaric, that underwent many different iterations and names until a point about 1930, when the form that this alphabet had taken was practically identical to the later well-known Tengwar that we know from The Lord of the Rings. It was still called by names like Quenya, and the letters often didn't have the same values that we know from later sources, but it had come to be attributed to Feanor already. And within the next year, Tolkien pretty much arrived at the Tengwar proper. And from here on until his death in 1973, only very few signs were added or dropped. But the work that continued over the next decades was very much only in coming up with different arrangements for different times and different purposes that Tolkien came to call the modes of Tengwar, at which we will have closer looks in later videos. So let us now dive into the internal chronology. From here on, I am facing the difficult task of filtering through all the different versions and incarnations of the internal chronology that Tolkien came up with over the decades to present to you in a coherent form a scenario that will most likely be what Tolkien would have called correct at the end of his life. In this, I have been very careful, and I try to be as transparent as possible by always providing you with the sources of my claims so that those interested can check for themselves. But I am under no illusion that each and every Tolkien scholar will agree with me on all details. So if you do have any comments, corrections or questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section or contact me via the means listed in the description of this video. But please be civil about it, there's already way too much orcish speech out there. In essays like the various iterations of the Feanorian alphabet that Tolkien wrote in the late 1930s and again round about 1950, so roughly at the time during which he worked on the appendices for The Lord of the Rings, which was in preparation for publication, and also later in Quenya and Eldar, written in 1959 or 1960, Tolkien gave us the following scenario. In Valinor, a writing system had been in use that was commonly attributed to one Rúmil of Tirion. This represented only consonants with full letter signs, mostly called sarati, to which vowels were added via diacritic signs, due to the common concept of the scholars of their time to analyze their speech in largely syllabic fashion. The consonant was thought of as the core of the smallest sound unit, to which a vowel was attached as a mere coloring. The resulting syllable was called a tengwe, and its written representation a tengwa. Feanor now took some of the basic letters which seemed to show a probably accidental systematic arrangement and expanded upon them, creating a precise and systematic chart of representations for consonantal sounds, some of which didn't even appear in their Quenya and Sindarin dialects. So it was in origin a phonetic script that could be used for languages such as Valarin or the prehistoric Elvish, which they reconstructed in their own philological endeavors. This original application of these new letters that were now exclusively referred to as the Tengwar was later called the Feanorian mode or primary mode, or even simply mode 1. But let us have a closer look. Chapter 2. The primary mode. This is a vertical writing line that was very often used with the sarati. And these are the sarati letters for T and D. This is the letter P, which can easily be interpreted as the sign for T with a closing bar at the bottom. So it would seem logical that this gap here be filled with a sign looking like this, featuring the doubled bow from D, but the closing bar from P, so that it should represent the sound B, taking the labial place of articulation from P, but the softer voiced pronunciation from D. This is not the case in Sarati, where the letter B looks like this. This is everything that Tolkien explicitly gives us on the matter. But in the latest iteration of the Rúmilian Sarati, this was the sign for K, which I assume was also taken, this time without the writing line, and given this shape, creating the Tengwa K, which by the logic that we established would also lead to this being the sign for G, since we've now got the closed leftward bows representing these velar consonants pronounced in the back of the mouth. Now it appears fairly obvious that the system has room for another series in which the bows are attached to the left as in the K series, but open as in the T series, So these two letters were made and they were usually attributed to the palatal sounds ch and j. Now these are considered to be the base forms, and you may have noticed that the stems, or Tengwar in Quenya, all extend downwards. And the true genius of this writing system in my eyes lies in the fact that almost all other sounds needed can be achieved by the systematic modification of this stem. If you raise the stem so that they now rise above but end on the writing line, we have shifted all the stop sounds into corresponding spirant sounds that are pronounced with a continuous friction. From t and d, we now have got th and the. From p and b, we've got f and v. From k and g, we've got ch and r. And lastly, from ch and j, we've got sh and j. Or alternatively, this series could also be used for sounds that weren't quite palatal but produced somewhat more on the front towards the tooth ridge, post-alveolar. So more like the English sounds ch, j, sh and j, depending on what was currently needed. Shortening the stem now creates two new classes of consonants. It would have been easily possible to attribute the forms with two bows to the very frequently occurring nasal consonants, and the forms with one bow to their voiceless counterparts. This would follow the logic established earlier, but the fact of the matter is that voiceless nasals are incredibly rare sounds that seem to appear only in later Sindarin, of which Feanor and the Noldarin law masters knew nothing yet. So this group of the simplest possible characters was instead attributed to the sounds considered to be the weakest of their respective articulatory group, mostly semivowels. So these letters are now n, m, ny, and ng, and these are r, w, y, and something by which Tolkien most likely meant the glottal stop. Lastly, Feanor also created two groups with extended stems, stretching both above and below, and these were in the original and most basic system used for aspirated stops, that is, the stops we already had in the first two rows, but with an added puff of air, so to say. So where these are t and p, these are t and p. I'm sorry if the distinction wasn't terribly clear, but personally I struggle with these because no such distinction is present in my native German or in English. So these are now all the Tengwar shapes that can be achieved by following the basic principles that Feanor established. But unfortunately, this doesn't quite cover all the sounds needed for the languages that were known to Feanor and the Noldarin scholars. So besides these base letters, a couple of additional letters are practically always needed. Again, from the Sarati, a plain line was borrowed to write the simple breath sound h, now oriented as a bare raised stem. And in one source, Tolkien also stated that the Sarat for y was another borrowing, but in a later source he writes that it rather derived from the base letter y as a mere calligraphic variant. But I think that both can be true simultaneously and that the sign was borrowed because of its resemblance, since it wasn't exactly needed. By the same logic, this letter for ch was probably derived from this base letter. This would free the base letter up to be solely used for sh, and in later systems the two letters were sometimes indeed considered to be variants of one another. However, it seems that later this letter frequently replaced the bare raised stem as the sign for h. Furthermore, a letter for s was needed, which was given one of these shapes, which I can only assume derived from the Tengwar for the quite similar th sound. In accordance with the base letter principle of doubling both to add voice, these Tengwar were also added to denote the sound z. According to one source, this letter was already derived for the voiceless hw as a mirrored form of the f Tengwar. But in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien makes it very clear that it was in fact a later derivation of Beleriand that I will address in a later video. Then we also need an l letter, which was given this shape. This might in origin be a letter of the k series deprived of its stem, but I assume it's rather a turned and mirrored form of the r letter. Lastly, a simple circle was also added as a variant of the w Tengwar, and it seems that the base letters for w and y were usually considered the full consonants, while their later derived alternative forms became more popular in the spelling of diphthongs in later modes. A slightly later convention must have been the use of a form of the letter s as a diacritic to denote voicelessness. This was most useful in the case of sh and hr that Quenya both contained, and I assume that this use came about because the scholars were very much aware that these sounds derived from historic sl and sr very often. This diacritic continued to be used, but from these forms here, these two new letters were also derived, which were sh and hr initially, but the hr letter soon came to be used for the plain voiced r also, allowing the base letter r to fulfill different functions that we will also meet in later videos. To fill that gap, the voicelessness diacritic was added a second time, resulting in this new hr letter. Besides those, however, the habit of appending a form of the s letter to mark a following s never went away, so that spellings like these could be found for final s. And it was also a very common means to abbreviate the clusters ts, ps, and ks. This could also be written in a loop to mark a voiced pronunciation, z. These are now finally all the consonantal letters. So let us get into the diacritics, tehtar. The only original diacritic mark affecting the value of the consonant is a plain bar. When placed above this, abbreviated the preceding nasal of the same articulatory series, like nt, nd, ns, mp, mb, nk, or ng. When placed below, it lengthened the consonant. Most of the usual diacritics were vocalic in nature, though, another aspect carried over from the Sarati, as already suggested earlier. In fact, most of these Oma tehtar, or vowel diacritics, were practically identical to the Sarati ones. A triple dot for a single one for I, and forwards and backwards curls for O and U. And even the acute accent, or tekko, for e is not very far off from the older Rumilian sign. So this is the complete roster of the 5 base vowels that were needed to write the Elvish dialects of Valinor of that time. These were not, however, the only languages that the lawmasters intended to write down, so several modified signs were also sometimes found, like the upside-down a sign to denote the e that was found in Valarin and the reconstructed prehistoric Common Elvish, or this sign, even closer to the Rumilian e, that could be employed for any additional vowel sound that the language in question might need, like maybe the open o that both Valarin and Common Elvish possessed. And they could also be combined in fashions like these to denote the fronted ö and ü that didn't even exist in any of the languages of Valinor. All these vowel signs were then usually placed above the letter that preceded them, or above a mere short stem that acted as a carrier in places where there was no consonant, as in the beginning of a word, or when several vowels stood next to each other. When these two vowels only formed one syllable, though, that is, when they formed a diphthong like I and au, there were several methods to mark this if the writer chose to. The second vowel could then be written below the consonant instead, but this was apparently rare, and it was more usual to write the second vowel as its consonantal counterpart y or w. All these vowel signs were usually considered short, and when a long vowel was needed, many of the signs could simply be doubled, but the single sign could also be placed above a long stem instead. The double dot was in fact mostly not used for long I, but for its semivowel counterpart y, so that a word like Quenya Tjave could be written like this instead of this. In most cases, it had to be placed below, though, in order to leave room for the vowel diacritic. Something similar could also be done for w, the semivowel counterpart of u, by using a modification of the U curl that bent upwards, and that was very rarely used for U itself, so that a word like Finwe could be abbreviated like this. So this is finally it, the Tengwar Feanor, as made by their creator, or at least as expanded by him and his colleagues soon after the invention. The original Tengwar mode, that was even later when more specific spelling varieties had been developed for individual languages still used in linguistic works, to discuss historical forms or pronunciations, or to write down what little we know of the language of the Valar. If you've had contact with the Tengwar before this video, much of what has been covered in this overview will undoubtedly be familiar to you, because while Tolkien presented this as an ancient Elvish invention in his mature version of his chronology, it is in fact pretty much what he had come up with to write English. It is of course not quite the same as the English modes that you may have encountered before, because those two do in a way have a place in the internal chronology that we have not reached quite yet, but that I plan to cover in much detail in later videos. But first we have to get out of Valinor, and before we do that, accompanying the Noldor on their journey towards Beleriand, we will have to go into the classical mode first, and observe how Feanor and the other lawmasters, and eventually the common people of the Noldor, will shape this mode. That is to be the first of the applied modes, that are optimized to spell the intricacies of one language alone. So please join me again in the future for part 2 of this journey through the history of the Tengwar, when we dive into Quenya.